New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani is backing off of one of his grocery store policies, as was unveiled at a press conference on Monday. Mamdani stood in front of a microphone, and the backdrop there looked like a Soviet grocery store with 30% markdowns. And he was touting this as some great accomplishment. 5 grocery stores in the city of New York that are destined to be a tax hole and are going to drive out of business a lot of bodegas and grocery store owners in the city. That should be a huge win if you're an anti-capitalist ideologue like Mamdani, a DSA-aligned radical who is determined to punish people with private property. I mean, we saw the pied-à-terre tax, and that essentially doxed tens of thousands of property owners there. Even a New York University professor named Scott Galloway objected to that. And Mamdani has tried to backtrack after his grocery store announcement because one of his associates was smart enough to jump on the grenade there and said that there would be IDs needed, library-esque cards, as the term was, in order to access the New York City grocery stores. Well, that is being walked back after conservative-leaning or independent media, more accurately, jumped on that and said essentially that this is huge hypocrisy because of the voter IDs being so vehemently opposed by DSA radicals like Zohran Mamdani. It was more than ironic. It was lyronic, as I put it, because there's no legitimate reason to oppose voter IDs that are in over 130 countries around the world. I mean, when you have African nations that implement voter IDs and the United States cannot even get them passed in California, for example, I mean, they're outlawed essentially in the state of California during elections, then there is something rotten in Denmark. Well, I mean, Denmark even has voter IDs, right? So one of the things that Mamdani did was to clarify that you don't need a government ID in order to get these groceries. So this is going to be disastrous because we're going to see what happened in New York City, the same thing that happened in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, and that is the Mercal grocery stores there that essentially became a hotspot for black market activities. Even the Colombians would come in and they would have smuggling operations until the Venezuelan government implemented not only IDs, including part of their national ID number, but also fingerprints. So that is coming to New York City eventually after this socialist experiment dies the way that it always does after we spend millions and millions of dollars supporting it. And speaking of which, one of his darling policies, universal childcare in New York City, is being scrutinized heavily after a new report that was posted in the New York Post laid bare that it would cost 50% more than he had calculated. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars in cost overrun projections already. Would cost approximately $8 to $9 billion, and that is $3 billion more than what he had originally estimated. So the cost overruns are just beginning in New York City. Congratulations to all the liberals there, you open-minded Americans who just decided to put this smiling Islamo-communist in charge of the most economically powerful city in the history of mankind at one point, and it's become a dilapidated shell of itself. New York City has fallen into disrepute, and then the New York governor at the helm of it all, Kathy Hochul, she's presiding over a failed state. And the COVID pandemic response that caused a lot of Americans like myself to flee, they have turned out to only hasten the inevitable demise. When you go woke, you go broke. When you go socialist, you are going to become a failed state. That has happened over and over again, whether you're talking about Cambodia or Ethiopia or Russia and a lot of other countries around the world that have tried socialism. It It does not work economically. It does not comport with human nature. And so now we're seeing that Mamdani is lying through his teeth while grinning the entire time, trying to get policies that don't work in reality simply because they sound good and people want free stuff. And it has to be paid for one way or another. And the hidden mechanism behind all of this that's making things a lot worse is the debt spending. It's being propped up to some degree by our treasury that is associated with the Federal Reserve and our fiat currency system, as well as the selling of treasury bonds. They are underwriting our debt spending. We're about $30 trillion in debt. A lot of it is fraud, if you believe Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency, approximately $1 trillion a year. That doesn't seem that far-fetched because the COVID pandemic fraud was hundreds of billions of dollars, if not approaching $1 trillion. So there's a lot of fraud coming along with all of this. And so what you see with these socialist radicals that get into power is they reward their cronies. That's how they get to power. They raise a lot of funds from NGOs and activist organizations, and they essentially kick it back to try to build a parallel power structure that can ultimately support this radical organizing, and eventually they can try to harness it through a cloward and pivot strategy and other ways of overwhelming the system, open borders policies, for example, flooding us with foreigners who exploit our system, like we saw with the Somali fraud scandal in Minnesota. We see it with Medicare and Medicaid fraud in California and other localities in the United States. So this is a real threat. And so Mamdani has become a poster child for DSA policies, and he is taking L after L, unlike the New York Knicks that he professes to support so much. Knicks fans don't believe you, Mamdani. They're not losers. Socialists are losers. That's what history tells us. That's not my personal opinion. But weigh in with your own thoughts about this. We always appreciate hearing from you at the Becker Brief.